Hey guys, it's Leah. Welcome back, or welcome if you are new, and welcome to the ultimate autumn reading guide. If there is one thing I know in life, it is what books you should be reading in autumn. So we have over 100 books that you should be adding to your autumn reading list. Whether you want fiction, classics, romance, fantasies, thrillers, horrors, a little bit of YA, we have everything. To make it a whole lot easier for you guys, I am going to timestamp each genre. So if you just want romance recommendations, if you just want thriller recommendations, or fantasy or classic recommendations, you'll be able to find them so easily. I imagine this video is going to be fairly long. It's probably going to be my longest video ever, so obviously feel free to go get yourself a little snack, a little sweet treat, your favorite autumnal drink. Have my trusty vanilla black tea in one of my favorite autumn mugs, and we're just going to get straight on into it because we have over 100 books to talk about today. I feel like the best place to start will be to my left with all of my fiction recommendations. In here we definitely have an array of fiction. We have ones that are more literary fiction, contemporary fiction, some that do borderline horror. I literally have a little bit of everything. Throughout this video, if you do see me like recommend a fiction book but you think that it's a horror book, please bear with me. There are definitely going to be so many books that are fiction but also quite sci-fi or romance or horror. Just bear with me. There are a lot of books to talk about, but we're going to start with fiction. On the top of my fiction stack is arguably the most quintessential autumn read in the world, and that is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I read this book about 2 years ago now. I still think about it every single day. I absolutely adored it. Of course, this is the peak, the epitome of dark academia. I feel like if you think of dark academia and autumn, this is the first book that comes to your mind. In my opinion, it's absolutely worth the read, so it has to be the first book that I recommend. This is what I meant in terms of genres, because then we have one that is actually sci-fi, but I don't have a sci-fi genre. I could have put it in fantasy, I could have put it in romance, but it is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal Al-Mota and Max Gladstone. This was a very recent read for me, a very recent 5-star. I am still thinking about it every single day. In this we are following two time travelers named Red and Blue, and they basically write each other letters, love letters spanning across a millennia. It's one of the most unique, heartbreaking, melancholic, eloquent books I have ever read in my entire life. This carries some of the best writing that I also have ever read. Looking for a really short fiction sci-fi read with a big love story element, then this has to be the one that you read this autumn. Next we have a novella that when I read it ripped my heart out, stomped on it, spat on it, tore it apart. Hex by Jenny Fagan. In Hex, we are following Giles Duncan in Scotland in the late 1500s. This is heavily inspired by the North Berwick witch trials, where Giles Duncan was essentially the youngest girl to ever be convicted and killed for being a witch. It still stands as one of the most heartbreaking books I've ever read, but one of the most impactful. It's less than 100 pages. Equally one of the most imperative and eloquent books ever. I will advocate for this book till the day I die. I really think more people should read it. It is the perfect book to cuddle up with and cry at the end this autumn. Next is another small one that I only read this year, and that is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This one I wouldn't say is cozy. By no means is this cozy. If anything, it's very philosophical. You will have to think absolutely when you read this book, but it is one definitely to cuddle up with under a blanket with a cup of tea and just binge read in one night. It absolutely floored me. In this we are following Piranesi, who is essentially navigating a labyrinth. He is pondering on life and on death and just the whole point of existence. Like I said, it's definitely a philosophical one. It's definitely one that you need to use your brain to read, but one that I think everybody should read. Again, another one that floored me. Next we have On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, another one that I read years ago and still has never left my side. I am endlessly in awe of Ocean Vuong's writing. He is also a poet. This was his only novel. He actually does have another novel out coming, I think in 2025. That is going to be my Joker. This was earth-shattering. What is it about autumn that makes me feel like I just want to read books that are either going to change my life or are going to rip my heart out? This is both of them. Following our protagonist, who is writing and narrating a letter to his mother, but she cannot read, so the whole time you are so aware that his mum is never going to be able to read this letter. It is heartbreaking. I do recommend checking the trigger warnings for this, but it is one of the most beautiful books I have ever read. One that I used to talk about all of the time but I haven't in so long, and is perfect for this time of year and like a dark evening, is After Dark by Murakami. This is a book set over the course of 24 hours. It is quite sci-fi-esque and technological, but equally so beautiful. It was the first Murakami that I ever read, and still my favourite, to be honest. If you like books that are fairly fever dream too and quite escapist, you are gonna love this. This I recommend going into knowing as little as possible. But it's one, not only because it is so short, but it is so digestible and so quick paced that you can binge read on like one stormy evening. I kind of want to do a reread of that this autumn and do it that way. I absolutely loved it. What I would give to read this for the first time again. Speaking about books that I wish I could read for the first time again, we have a stack of books that are more quite post-apocalyptic realistic, fever dream, dystopian, that sort of subgenre of course fiction, but again you could say sci-fi, is one of those that very much crosses the borders. First of which is of course The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa, one that I speak about every single day. This is one of my favourite books of all time. It is a dystopian novel where we are set on this island where things essentially go missing. Once these things go missing, the public for the most part will just automatically forget them, but some people do remember them, whether it's a word or an object or just anything. And if you do remember the things that have vanished, the memory police will come and take you, babe. This and the commentary on humanity, the characters are so incredibly raw and real and heartfelt. It really converses and discusses why we place meaning on the things that we do. For example, why we place meaning on technology more than we do the natural world. It was fascinating. And not only was it fascinating, the writing was astonishing. One of my favourite books, please read it. One that I read this year and is definitely perfect for this season is The Country Will Bring Us No Peace by Matthew Simard. This one is another one that feels quite post-apocalyptic, but it's less in your face than the other ones. In this we are following a couple who have been struggling conceiving a baby, so they decide to go to the middle of nowhere in the countryside and just spend the whole time conceiving a baby, trying to get pregnant. What they don't realise is the town and the countryside that they are in is very strange. This book is so eerie and so atmospheric. It explores grief at length and how grief is so individualistic, how even if you are grieving the same person, your grief is going to be so unique. For me, the atmosphere definitely carried this book over the plot, but the atmosphere in general, this is another one that you can binge read in 24 hours because it is so short. Autumn is undoubtedly the perfect season for this one. Another post-apocalyptic one that I absolutely love, and again I would love to do a reread of this autumn, is Severance by Ling Ma. I read this for the first time last year and it is another one that never leaves my mind. This one, as I say, is very post-apocalyptic. It plays, oh my god, this is so unique. The entire way that Ling Ma plays on the concept of zombies is the most unique thing I've ever seen. She discusses at length consumerism and capitalism, how her concept of zombies is rooted in capitalism, and how even at the end of the world and in a post-apocalyptic state, consumerism and capitalism would still exist. This one, for so many reasons, felt so real and so raw and so realistic. It had so many similarities to COVID, which was really interesting because this was published in 2018. One that I definitely think everyone should read. Another one that I think everyone should read is my favourite book of 2024 so far. You heard it here, not first. I've said it multiple times because I cannot stop talking about it. It is It Lasts Forever and Then It Is Over by Anne DeMarco. I feel like there was a hole in my heart before reading this book and nothing has filled that void since. This is absolutely post-apocalyptic. We are following a girl in the afterlife essentially who cannot remember her name. She cannot remember the life she lived prior. All she can remember is that she loved this one thing. We don't know whether this one thing is a person or an object. We just know that she loved them with everything in her. It is a zombie narrative and it discusses at length hunger and survival and how you can still be hungry even when you're dead. This one definitely is quite philosophical. If you like philosophical books that are gonna make you stare at the wall for 2 hours straight right after it, please read this one. The best book I've read all year. I don't know who I am if I'm not obsessed with this book. And the perfect one to recommend after that, you guys know I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. Another one of my all-time favourite books. Again, very post-apocalyptic, quite dystopian-esque. In this we are following 40 women who are trapped underground in a bunker. They don't know how they got there, why they are there. We as the reader don't know how they got there or why they are there. It is so much about womanhood and survival. How when the rest of the world perishes, you survive as an individual but equally in a group of strangers. It is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read in my entire life. Again, it is one that I think about every single day. The ending, the best ending, the best last paragraph, the best last word I've ever read in any book ever. If you know, you know. I'm endlessly floored by this book. Again, I would love to do a reread. I feel like I could read this book every single day for the rest of my life and never be bored. Please read it if you haven't already. And then the last book for the post-apocalyptic subgenre is Private Rights by Julia Armfield. This was one of my most anticipated books of this year, and did I love it as much as I thought I would? No. But honestly, looking back on it now and looking back at my reading experience and this book as a whole, I definitely look at it with rose-tinted glasses. I am just obsessed with everything Julia Armfield writes. In this we are following 3 queer sisters whose dad has very recently died. Their dad was very important in the company and like his sort of like architecture world. Simultaneously, whilst they are talking about and grappling with their grief of losing a parent and losing their dad, it is kind of the end of the world. It does not stop raining. Considering in the UK we just had the wettest summer to date, and no doubt autumn is going to be the same, this is definitely a perfect one to read. Like, again, again whilst it is raining under a blanket. I am obsessed with everything Julia Armfield writes, despite this probably being one of my least favourites from her. Definitely a perfect one for autumn. Obviously, if I'm recommending that one from Julia Armfield, I also need to recommend her other two, which are Our Wives Under the Sea and Salt Slow. Salt Slow was her debut. It's actually a short story collection, and this again perfect for autumn. It kind of borderlines horror. So many short stories in here had me absolutely floored. Each of them are so unique. You really do get a taste of Julia Armfield's writing and how expansive and the range of her writing. She's definitely one of my favourite authors, and that was absolutely proven by Our Wives Under the Sea, which was actually the first that I ever read from her. This book was everything to me when I first read it. In it, we are essentially following Leah and Miri. Leah goes on these deep sea missions, months at a time, in a submarine. In the past, everything has been normal. She comes back and she's normal, when one day she is gone for about 6 months. She doesn't return until one day she does, but she is a little bit different. This is so speculative and so ambiguous. If you don't like ambiguous books or ambiguous endings, don't read this. If you do, you have taste, read it. This is another one where the ending absolutely floored me. I fell in love with it, and ever since then I've been obsessed with Julia Armfield, so cannot recommend that one enough. Another sort of short story collection is Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. Carmen Maria Machado wrote In the Dream House, which was her memoir. That was the first I ever read from her, and I fell in love with it. I fell in love with her narrative and her voice. And this, as far as I'm aware, is the only other thing she has still ever published, and it is a short story fiction collection, and I really loved it. Again, these borderline horror, science fiction, they are also quite fairy tale-esque. I absolutely love them. Going on to another one of my favourite authors, I had to recommend you 3 of her books, and that is Mona Award with All's Well, Bunny and Rouge. I am obsessed with every single one of these books. Again, you can say they are somewhat horror. They all actually, to be honest, are somewhat horror. They are all incredibly fever dream and speculative. Bunny was my first one that I ever read. It was actually one of my like first unhinged women, feral women sort of books, and it made me fall in love with the genre. This was 5 stars for me. Loved it. I then went on to All's Well by Mona Award, which now stands still as my favourite Mona Award and actually one of my favourite books of all time. This book is everything to me. The chronic illness representation, I've never felt so seen in a book ever in my entire life. The character analysis, the horror elements, the theatre element, I was just utterly obsessed with this. And then Rouge, I also absolutely adored. I cannot recommend Mona Award enough. She is absolutely an author for me. I'm obsessed with everything she writes, and autumn is her season. Finally, we're on to the last 3 books for the fiction genre. We then have 2 books again from the same author, and that is Jenny Havell. But I have realised that I've actually picked up Paradise Rot and Paradise Rot, as opposed to Paradise Rot and Girls Against God. I am absolutely obsessed again with Jenny Havell. I do definitely feel like she isn't for everyone. I think if you don't like speculative fiction, Paradise Rot is also incredibly bleak and grotesque, and I definitely recommend checking trigger warnings for both of her books. But for me, they just work immensely. Writes in depth about unhinged women, feral women, queerness. This one too, Paradise Rot, definitely has some religious imagery. Another autobiography for me, Paradise Rot was my first, and then I went on to Girls Against God, but I would recommend them both for autumn. And then last but certainly not least, this is actually probably one of the only books on this entire list that I haven't read yet, but I am reading so soon, and everyone has kind of been begging me to, so I promise it's happening. If We Were Villains by Emma Rio. It feels kind of wrong recommending this when I haven't read it yet, but obviously this is another one, Dark Academia, that everybody loves, everybody recommends. I don't feel right to talk about an autumn book recommendations or books to add to your reading list without this, even if I haven't read it, but I am reading it very soon. Okay, the next genre that we could do, I honestly think it makes the most sense to then go on to classics, in which, I'm not gonna lie, we have quite a ton. I'm a classics girl. So many of my favourite classics are gothic classics. I did go to university and I studied English literature and creative writing, so a lot of these I read whilst I was at uni. But equally, even just reading classics for pleasure and for leisure, I absolutely adore it. They are some of my favourite books of all time. So a lot of these honestly are gothic classics. Unsurprisingly. A lot of them are ones that you would expect for autumn recommendations, one of which, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is one of the perfect classics for anybody trying to get into classics. I absolutely loved it. It was one of the first ones that I ever read. Again, I need to do a reread because I have forgotten so much of this book. It is really short. I feel like everyone knows what this is about, so I'm going to save my voice and not explain it, but definitely one perfect for autumn. Another one perfect for autumn is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I love this book so much. I need to read more Daphne du Maurier because this is still the only one that I've ever read. Rebecca is, oh my god, just everything. It is so gothic. The character analysis in this, the setting, the atmosphere of the abbey and the estate, so perfect for autumn. Of course, then we have Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Fun fact, the first time that I ever read Frankenstein, I was not the biggest fan, but since I reread it a couple of years ago and I really enjoyed it, but I feel like if I reread it now, which, not gonna lie, I really want to, I want to reread all of these. Who am I kidding? I feel like now it would become one of my favorite books of all time. This is specifically the 1818 text. Frankenstein, again, everyone knows what it is about, one of the best stories ever written. Another one that is painfully obvious for autumn, but I had to recommend, was Dracula by Bram Stoker. This, I'm not gonna lie, is one of my most annotated books. Dracula is a classic that is incredibly dense. I don't think that this is a good one for beginners. It is absolutely dense. It took me so long to read, but I definitely had the time of my life, and I definitely think it was worth the read. Not only is it like obviously one of the most infamous stories ever written, but it was really fun to read, and there are so many adaptations now. I love being able to refer to this every time I read a new retelling of it, or I watch something, or I read just a new vampire story. I love seeing the original inspiration. Actually, talking about original inspiration, Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. I feel like the last time I said that and pronounced the author that way, I got ripped apart online, so if that's not how they're pronounced, sorry. This is actually the vampire story that supposedly came before Dracula. This is definitely more accessible. I mean, the size difference alone is actually kind of insane, but equally it's also sapphic. I absolutely loved the character analysis in this and the relationship in this. This is definitely one that I would recommend for classic beginners. One that might feel a little bit rogue in here in comparison to a lot of the other classics is The Besieged City by Clarice Lispector. Clarice Lispector is my absolute all-time favourite author. She wrote my favourite book of all time, Near to the Wild Heart. I feel like every time I talk about Clarice Lispector, The Besieged City is one of the ones that I discuss least, even though it's definitely one of my favourite books that I've read this year. This, again, I feel is one that is perfect to cozy up with in an autumn night. This, again, is another one that is fairly short. It is a modern classic, so it is a lot more digestible than a lot of these other ones. Please don't let the fact that it is grouped in with all of this scare you off. The Besieged City is utterly beautiful. It discusses at length womanhood and girlhood, how to survive in a world when you are a woman. Or things like dust and furniture take up space. It is very philosophical. Again, think about it all the time. One that I feel like a lot of people would have already read, and if you haven't, you genuinely have no excuse, because it is what, 40 pages? Is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Another one that I'm definitely going to reread. I have no excuse. It is 40 pages. This is a gothic short story. I honestly cannot remember too much about it, which is why, again, I want to reread it, but I know that everybody loves it. A lot of people studied it for school. On the back it says, this horrifying semi-autobiographical feminist story of imprisonment and madness scandalized 19th century society. Then have Blind Owl by Sadak Hediat. Before I even say anything about this book, I highly recommend checking trigger warnings if you decide to go into it. This, again, is a very short classic, a very short novella. In the 20th century, when it was first published in Iran, the public outrage was insane and equally so fascinating. Definitely recommend researching that if you do read this book. This is so Viva Dream, so unreliable. The unreliable narrator was absolutely fascinating. It's also a book told in 2 parts. In this, we are following our protagonist, who is very much addicted to opium and alcohol, and due to that, his narrative is incredibly unreliable. Following his stream of consciousness, which is very negative. This is not a book you enjoy, but it is one that is so powerful. He does some very questionable things. He ends up being covered in blood and the police are after him, and then the second half is uncovering everything that happened in the first half in one of the most unique ways I've ever seen in my entire life. This is a book that once you finish it, you are going to want to reread it from the first page the second you put it down. I, again, want to do a reread. Take a shot every time I say that, damn. This book has never left me, but please check trigger warnings before picking it up. Next we have 2 books from the same author, one of my gals, one of my favourite authors ever, Shirley Jackson, specifically The Haunting of Hill House and We Have Always Lived in the Castle. I do feel like these are her 2 most popular books, and they're still the only 2 that I've ever read. I definitely plan on reading some new Shirley Jackson this year. The Haunting of Hill House is obviously so infamous, especially after the Netflix show came out. I would recommend reading this even if you watched the show, whether you loved it or you disliked it. It's very different to the book than the show, but it equally carries so much of the same magic, and this is a story that I just love to the bottom of my heart. And then We Have Always Lived in the Castle, my favourite Shirley Jackson yet. This book changed me. It changed my reading. This is quintessentially gothic. Her writing style is absolutely beautiful. The way it talks about family and sisterhood and trauma. Another one that is so incredibly short. If you've ever thought about picking Shirley Jackson up, I would genuinely read her whenever. Read her all year round, babe. Autumn is her season, so I cannot recommend it more now. Another short story that's literally about 50 pages. This book is quite deceiving because it is a collection of Edgar Allan Poe's work. The one that I'm going to recommend specifically is The Fall of the House of Usher. This, again, the Netflix series came out. It is adapted by the same people who did A Haunting of Hill House. I actually never finished that adaptation. I need to go through and rewatch it, but this short story floored me the first time that I ever read it. Again, so quintessentially gothic. Edgar Allan Poe's narrative is so unique, so magical, but so dark. If you're looking for a gothic horror short story, this and The Yellow Wallpaper are the way to go. We then have The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is one that I read for uni and I loved it. This carries so many classic gothic motifs like the uncanny, like the doppelganger and the double self. I feel like this is one of the original doppelganger, double self sort of gothic books. It is so unique, equally so fun to read, so dark, so gloomy. I loved it. And the last two classics to recommend are, again, my gals. I'm just sharing a ton of my favourite authors. Who am I kidding in this video? We have Charlotte Bronte and Emily Bronte, and I don't mean to leave my girl Anne Bronte out. Anne Bronte, I love you, babe. But for autumn specifically, as much as I did love The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, I have to recommend Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. These two books shaped me growing up. Jane Eyre is the entire reason that I fell in love with books and I fell in love with literature, and that I went to study literature, and ultimately that I started talking about books online. I just have everything to thank, and I owe everything to Jane Eyre. Honestly, this book shaped me. This book was it for me. And then obviously Wuthering Heights. This was another one that as soon as I read Jane Eyre, I went straight onto this. These are two of my most reread books in my entire life. I'm very intrigued though, because as I said, Jane Eyre shaped everything for me for as long as I could remember, until I read Near to the Wild Heart by Clarice Lispector. This was my #1 book of all time. Do I think that if I reread it at the age I'm at now, it would still be a favourite? I'm not sure. I feel like it would still be a favourite of all time, if anything, because of nostalgia. But I do feel like now Wuthering Heights would be my preferred Bronte. Which is kind of terrifying to say, and I really should reread them before I make a sort of statement like that. I definitely do want to reread them. I would love to reread them and read them with some of you for the first time. I feel like that would be really fun. So if anyone's interested in that, actually, I might have something coming really soon that means that we could do a reread together. I just love the Brontes with every single thing in me. They are the epitome of autumn for me. I am in love with them and their entire being. Cannot recommend enough. Okay, now that we've done fiction and classics, next we have romance, we have thrillers, we have horrors, and we have fantasy, and then YA. Let's then do romance, because it is the smallest stack that I have physically. Once I have gone through all of these books that I own, we'll then at the end go on to some books that I don't own but are still perfect for autumn. We definitely have a lot more romances that I don't own, but two books from the same author that I have to recommend is Ashley Poston, specifically The Dead Romantics and The 7 Year Slip. I did read a novel love story by her this year, but I don't feel like that one's as autumnal as these. The 7 Year Slip is still one of my favourite romances ever, if not like my top 2 romances. This feels like autumn in New York. This is literally just autumn with sort of ghosts. Cannot recommend them enough. I feel like everybody knows what they're about. I love them. I then have a really recent read for me, and that is Out on a Limb by Hannah Bonham Young. Not only do I feel like this is the perfect romance to cozy up with this autumn, but the protagonists literally also meet at a Halloween party at the very start of the book. This again instantly became one of my favourite romances. I absolutely became so obsessed with these protagonists and with their relationship and the tension and the communication. This was a romance that felt so refreshing and so fun and didn't take itself too seriously whilst handling such serious topics like pregnancy. It also has disability representation. I am in love with this book. I am never going to stop talking about it. I absolutely loved it. And then the last romance that I own physically that I read last year, and again would love to do a reread, is You Again by Kate Goldbeck. This is literally pitched as When Harry Met Sally. I'm a Nora Ephron girl, please read it. Autumn in New York, friends to lovers. I think about this all the time. It has bisexual representation. I loved this when I first read it. I feel like I also don't see too many people talk about it. If the cover doesn't give you autumn enough, take my word that this is the perfect autumnal romance. Next we're going to go on to fantasy, because it is the closest stack next to me. All of these here, those are thrillers and horrors, so we're going to do fantasy next, specifically YA fantasy to begin with. The YA fantasy slash sort of fiction-y, I don't really know how to categorize this, that I see nobody talk about ever, is Watch Over Me by Nina LaCour. I read this for the first time nearly 4 or 5 years ago, and I remember it was originally pitched as sort of a YA fantasy sort of Jane Eyre retelling. One of the reasons that I love this so much, and I still remember it so vividly, and I would say is perfect for autumn, it was one of the first books that I read where like ghosts and entities and spirits were actual characters characters. Ghosts in this book walk among the living, and I absolutely love that. It made it so eerie and so atmospheric. As far as I can see with the tabs too, I absolutely adored the writing. Again, this is one that I feel like I never see anyone talk about. It's quite like an OG booktube book, I feel like, but it's one that I would be really intrigued to revisit. If you have read this, please let me know, because I haven't seen anyone talk about it for years. I then have a book that I believe is coming out next year. I do have the indie edition. I read it whilst it was independently published, and it has since been picked up by a publisher. It is Modern Divination by Isabel Agajanyan. This I ate up this year. I absolutely loved it. This is a YA fantasy, sort of like academic rivals to lovers. One of my favourite things in this book were not only the protagonists as individuals, and then when it came to their relationship together, I loved it, but the atmosphere and the setting. I love an academic rivals to lovers in a fantasy book, as you will be able to tell, and this one did it perfectly. Like, absolute chef's kiss. I am so happy that it got picked up by a publisher. I don't know if you can still currently get this, so if you can't, I apologise, but please read it next year once it is out. I'm definitely going to reread the traditionally published version. I think there are slight changes being made, but I loved this. Then we have A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. Everybody read this last year. Everybody was talking about it last year, and I actually really enjoyed it. I know it did get a little bit of mixed hype, but I really loved it. Again, more than anything, the atmosphere and the academic rivals to lovers. It gags me every time. I absolutely love that trope. If anyone has any recommendations, please let me know. The atmosphere, the romance, the dark academia element, I loved it so much. This still stands as the only Ava Reid I believe that I've read. Then we have a book that I feel like I have quite an unpopular opinion about, but due to the fact that I still own it and I do want to give it a second chance, it is Belladonna by Adeline Grace. First time that I ever read this, I did enjoy it, again, if anything, just because of the atmosphere, but it wasn't a favourite. I absolutely adored how Death was a character in this. I've already established how much I love unique narratives, but when Death is a character and a narrative, it floors me every time. That was my favourite part of this book. I definitely, as I said, want to give it a second chance, but I know that everybody loves it. It's very gothic. I'm intrigued to carry on with the series, I think. We then have my first book of the year. This was literally the first book that I read in 2024, A Tempest of Tea by Hafsa Faisal. I had never read anything from this author. This is a YA fantasy, of course. It is very heisty. I haven't read too many fantasies that include a heist. The ones that I had read, I didn't really think I really enjoyed that trope, but then I read this, I really enjoyed it. The ending of this book too, if you have read it, you know I cannot wait for the next installment. This is definitely a perfect fantasy to read this autumn. The character analysis, the found family, I love the found family trope so much. This was so good. I cannot wait for the next installment. Then I'm pretty sure these are the last two YA fantasies that I have. This is a series or a duology. It is the Divine Rivals duology by Rebecca Ross. I still have not read Ruthless Vows. I don't know when I am going to get to it, but this series, this book, I really loved last year. This book had me in a chokehold for months. It put me in a massive book hangover because it was all I wanted to reread. As I said, Academic Rivals to Lovers gets me every damn time, and this was one of the first that I ever read. The atmosphere, the letter element, the magic, I really enjoyed. I'm very intrigued to read this one because I haven't heard the best things. If you read it, again, let me know. Then going on to adult fantasy, we're going to start with this one because as far as I was aware, it was YA. It was a YA fantasy duology, and then people said that it was actually more adult. Now that I have read the first one, again, it's another one that I haven't read the second one just yet because I very recently read it. I do get that it is a little bit more adult but still feels quite YA. It is the Shepherd King duology. I think that's what it's called, where we have One Dark Window and Two Twisted Crowns by Rachel Gillig. I read One Dark Window literally at the time of filming this, what, a week ago, and my opinions were a little bit mixed. A lot of people have said that they believe that I'm going to prefer the second book in this duology, which I'm really intrigued about. I actually will be reading this very soon, and I do feel like, grievances aside, this is the perfect sort of fantasy duology to read in autumn. It is so atmospheric, the setting is so eerie, the magical system is so incredibly unique. I mean, it's literally based on tarot cards. Like, it's so autumnal. I know everyone absolutely loves these and talks about these. You probably already know what they are about. I do think that they are really good for autumn. Another series that I actually only have the second book for right now is the Ninth House series by Leigh Bardugo with then Hellbent. As far as I'm aware, there is one more book. I think it's a trilogy. I read Ninth House when it was first published. I can't even remember what year that was, and my feelings on it were again a little bit mixed, but then I read Hellbent this year. Thoroughly, so much more enjoyed Hellbent than Ninth House. These are dark academia adult fantasies. They definitely come with trigger warnings, so I would recommend checking them up. In them we are following our protagonist protagonist who is at Yale, and she's kind of exploring and exposing these secret societies in Yale. It is very dark. The magic system is very dark. She can see ghosts. Honestly, these are my favourite works, and this is my favourite universe from Leigh Bardugo. I cannot wait to reread Ninth House and then Hellbent before the third one comes out. God knows when that will be, because we had to wait so long for Hellbent. If you know, you know. If you were there, what, the drought? If you're looking for an adult dark academia fantasy that is quite dark, this is the perfect series. Then we have The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi, and this, again, when I first read it, I really liked it. This is a fantasy that feels very eerie and atmospheric and dark. It's full of so many secrets and a dark, dingy estate. The twist in this, if you don't see it coming, will make the reading experience worthwhile in and of itself. Would recommend. Another very recent read for me was Slewfoot by Brom. I'm not going to say too much about this one because it was in my last reading vlog, but I thoroughly enjoyed this. If you like folk horror with religious imagery, this is set in Connecticut 1666. This is one of the most atmospheric and visual books that I have ever read. The illustrations are gorgeous. This all round is just such a beautiful book. Definitely recommend for the autumn. I feel like there is no better season to read this in. Then we have arguably my favourite fantasy series in the world, and that is the Serpent and the Wings of Night series by Carissa Broadbent. We obviously have The Serpent and the Wings of Night and The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King, as well as Six Scorched Roses by Carissa Broadbent. Loved all of them. I'm obsessed with this series. I cannot tell you how excited I am for the next installment. This is more of a duology, and then you have some standalones in the universe, and then there is a new book coming out with different characters. The other standalone that I absolutely adored was Slaying the Vampire Conqueror. I am just obsessed with this series. If I hadn't read this series already, I absolutely would have saved it to binge read it in autumn. I am obsessed with it. Carissa Broadbent is definitely my favourite fantasy author. I cannot wait for the next book. Speaking of an author who I absolutely love in the fantasy space, I feel like this is more of a retelling sort of vibe. We have S.T. Gibson, specifically A Dowry of Blood, Evocation, and An Education in Malice. There is something so visual and so poetic and so beautiful about all of S.T. Gibson's books. They are perfect to read in autumn. I feel like these books are quintessentially autumn. Like, there is no other season to read them in. They're actually already in order of favourites. My favourite is still A Dowry of Blood. I rated that 5 stars. An Education in Malice I rated 4, 4.5, and then Evocation I rated 4. I absolutely adore everything S.T. Gibson writes. They're definitely an auto-buy author for me, and they are perfect for autumn. Another auto-buy author for me is V. Schwab. We have The Vicious duology and then The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. These are incredibly different. Vicious is actually one of the first books that I read when I was getting back into reading, like around GCSE time. I love this duology so much. This book was a 5-star, and I believe the second book was more like a 3.5, but definitely read Vicious if you haven't already. And in a very different tone, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue had me in a chokehold. When it first came out, oh my god, I was obsessed with it. But like, this book changed my life when I first read it. The atmospheres, the relationships, Addie's character was so relatable and so real and so raw, and I saw so much of myself in her painfully. This book is so beautiful. It's absolutely raved about for a reason. If you haven't read it already, definitely take this as your sign to do so. And then the last 2 physical books that I have for the fantasy or the adult fantasy genre is Babel by R.F. Kuang. This book broke me. No book has broken me the way that this book did. I read it when it first came out, so what, like 2 years ago now? That's flown by. I sobbed at the end. I've never cried at an ending in any book like I did this one. This, of course, is a dark academia that discusses at length colonialism and racism. R.F. Kuang is an auto-buy author for me. I will read anything she puts out. Babe, I would read her receipts. I would read anything she writes. This is a 6-star read for me. I think about it every single day. And then the last book for the adult fantasies that I have physically is One for My Enemy by Olivia Blake. This is still the only Olivia Blake I have ever read. This is, oh my god, I fell in love with this when I first read it. This is like a Romeo and Juliet retelling where we are following 2 opposing sort of like witchy families who despise each other. They hate each other. Obviously, as these things go and how Romeo and Juliet goes, there is a forbidden romance. The romance in this, there's one trope. I feel like I can't say what the trope is because it would spoil it, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone. There is one trope in romances, especially fantasy romances, that kills me every time, and this had it, and I fell in love with this book. This made me want to read so many more Olivia Blakes. If anyone has any Olivia Blake recommendations that feel most like One for My Enemy, please let me know. I don't really know where to go from here. I absolutely adored this one. Please read it. Then going on to some thrillers and some horrors. Again, I have split these into YA and then adult, so we'll start with the YA ones. Honestly, there aren't that many, just mainly 2 authors who I love. First and foremost, foremost, we of course have Holly Jackson. So we have A Good Girl's Guide to Murder series, the reappearance of Rachel Price, and 5 Survive. I have read every single thing that Holly Jackson has ever released. She is undoubtedly one of my favourite, not only favourite YA thriller authors, but thriller authors in general. She is an auto-buy author for me. I feel like her books are, again, so perfect to cozy up with in autumn. They are so fast-paced, so bingeable. The A Good Girl's Guide to Murder series is yet again another one that kind of got me back into reading for enjoyment, but I love all of these. Honestly, every single thing from her has been 4 stars and above. I recommend it all. I love her. And then the other author and the other series who I would recommend absolutely for YA thrillers, I'm gonna struggle to carry these, is the Truly Devious series by Maureen Johnson. I'm pretty sure that this up is the order. I could absolutely be wrong. I know sometimes I get confused between these two. The Truly Devious series was yet again another one that got me back into reading for enjoyment. I again am obsessed with Maureen Johnson. I'll read everything she releases. Truly Devious series, I feel like I'll be rereading by the time I'm 90. Like, I'm obsessed with them, and I do actually want to do a reread. Maybe that could be a fun video challenge. But yeah, I've seen Truly Devious have her rounds again online. A lot of people are starting to pick them up again, and it honestly fills me with so much joy because I love this series. If you're looking for a YA thriller, sort of murder mystery, dark academia vibe, this is the perfect series. Honestly, what I would give to read these for the first time again, I'm obsessed with them. And then finally, the last physical stack of books that we have. My voice is on fire. We have adult thrillers and horrors. We are then going to go on to some of the books that I don't own that I would still recommend. But the last physical stack, first and foremost, we have the My Heart is a Chainsaw series by Stephen Graham Jones. I have only read My Heart is a Chainsaw. I have not read Don't Fear the Reaper, and I know the third one is also out now. This, when I first read it, I fell in love with it. I absolutely adored it because it was so slasher-like. In this, we are following a protagonist who is obsessed with slasher movies. She's kind of like writing a dissertation on slashers, and she analyzes her own life as if it were a slasher movie. So she would look at someone, she'll be like, okay, you would be the final girl, you would be the murderer. And I loved it. It was camp, it was fun, it was dark. I cannot wait to carry on with the series. Then have We Spread by Ian Reid. This is definitely more of a literary horror sort of vibe. Ian Reid also wrote I'm Thinking of Ending Things, which actually, again, I would definitely recommend. This was so creepy. It is definitely a speculative and ambiguous one, so if you don't like ambiguous books, again, probably not going to like this. In this, we are following our protagonist, who is an elderly woman. She moves into a residential care facility because she is old, and her husband dies. So before he dies, he's like, okay, you need to move into here. So she does, but this care facility is very strange. Some really strange happenings go on, and you really cannot tell if it is a state of her mind that is deteriorating or these things are actually occurring. And I loved that. I love an unreliable narrator. Writing in this was so engaging, and a one that you can absolutely binge read. I really loved this one. A thriller that I read this year that I really loved, and I do think is worth the hype, is None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. I definitely had my grievances with this. I put it all up on my Goodreads, a whole review of everything that pissed me off about this book, but ultimately I had the time of my life. I absolutely binge read this. This is definitely a thriller that I think is deserving of its hype. I would recommend going into it knowing as little as possible. Loved it. Actually then have like the second standalone book that's not in a series that I haven't read yet, but again, I will be reading very soon, so I want to add it in this video. It is They Never Learn by Lane Fargo. I'm very intrigued to see how I feel about this. We are following a teacher on a university campus who is essentially just killing boys on campus who are wronging girls. It follows an unhinged and feral woman, which I absolutely loved. I've been anticipating this for years. It's a TBR veteran. I'm getting to it very, very soon, like in the next week or so. So I kind of wanted to mention it. Oh my god, a horror book that scared the absolute shit out of me. This book is still the scariest book I've ever read, and I honestly never get scared at books, so this one surprised me. It is Gallows Hill by Darcy Coates. I know Darcy Coates has written so many books. We're like, how many books? I have no idea. If you know, please let me know, but we're talking like minimum 12. I randomly decided to pick this one up well over a year ago, and it scared me to my core. The ghosts in this, terrifying. It's kind of a haunted house story. It's very unique. I recommend going into it knowing nothing, but if you want a very, very scary, creepy horror, that will do it. Another horror that kind of creeped me out, it is a possession horror, and that is Come Closer by Sarah Grant. This is tiny, so I absolutely cannot recommend this enough for autumn. I read this last year at the very end of summer, beginning of autumn, in the middle of a thunderstorm on my balcony in one sitting, and I had the time of my life. As I said, it is a possession horror, so it felt incredibly claustrophobic and very unreliable. What I would give to read this for the first time, please read it. We then have two thrillers from the same author, and that is Riley Sager. Two of my favourite ones, to be honest. The Only One Left and Home Before Dark. I've read near enough all of his books, I'm pretty sure, other than The Last Time I Lied and the newest one, and these two are still definitely my favourites. Riley Sager is definitely an author who is incredibly divisive. You either love his books or you hate them. I'm definitely on the love, but I can see certain criticism exorcisms. This is a haunted house story. I absolutely loved it. And then this is the one that everyone was talking about last year. It was crazy. This one go into knowing nothing, but these are my favorites, so I would recommend these two. Arguably still my favorite thriller of all time is No Exit by Taylor Adams. This one, what I would give to read this one for the first time, honestly. This had me floored. This is set during one night during a snowstorm. This is also such a unique thriller because by page like 10, you know who the killer is. This had me sat on the edge of my seat the entire time. If you were ever going to read only one thriller, please let it be this one. It's my favorite thriller still, ever. Then have a book that I read fairly recently. Part of me does wish I waited for autumn to read it. Simultaneously, it was a TBR veteran and it's been on my TBR for 3 years. Guys, I'm losing my voice. It is The Last House on Needless Street by Katrina Ward. This is more of a horror than a thriller, but it very much borderlines the two. This is one of the most unique horrors I've ever read. Oh my god, I was floored by it. Like, the ending I did not see coming. It is so unique. The narrative is so unreliable but so addicting. You will not be able to put this book down. The ending, oh my god, as I said, I so wish I read this years before I did so I could have screamed about it sooner, but everyone that said that this book is a 5-star plus or like is so worth the hype are not lying. This is incredible. If you haven't read this yet, count your luck and please read it. And then last but certainly not least, for the horror genre, I had to include Junji Ito, who is a horror manga artist. I have read so many Junji Itos now, but two of my favorite collections are Tombs and Frankenstein. He is one of the most infamous horror manga artists. His brain is equally enchanting as it is utterly terrifying and so grotesque and disgusting, but in the best way. If you've never read a manga or you've never read a horror manga, I cannot recommend Junji Ito enough. Like, they are perfect to read at night, cuddled up again. These two are two of my favorite collections. They are sort of like short stories, but this one has more overarching themes in terms of following one main character. I absolutely love them. It's not autumn for me unless I read at least one Junji Ito. Those were all of my physical books that I would recommend. I am covered. I'm surrounded by books. I wish you could see, but we do have a fair few books that I don't own that I definitely want to recommend. Honestly, I've done this the wrong way. I shouldn't have kept it to the end. I should have put them in their like respective genres. But anyway, some fiction books that I would recommend that I don't own. I'm gonna go through them fairly quickly. Please do forgive me. I'm losing my voice. First and foremost, we have Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, another post-apocalyptic read that I loved. This one is absolutely going to become a modern classic. I know so many people adore it for good reason. I cannot recommend it enough. We also have Mrs. S by Kay Patrick. I feel like this one is a really underrated gem. It was published, was it this year or last year? It's very recent. It is sapphic, it is dark academia, it has one of the most unique narratives I've ever read. I wish more people spoke about it. I read it and I fell in love with it. Definitely recommend. And then the last fiction book for ones that I don't own is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, except I do own it. I just have no idea where my copy is gone. This was another one of those books that I read when I was getting back into reading for enjoyment, and I sobbed like a bitch. This was the first book I ever cried at. When I mentioned how I love unique narratives and death as a character, this was the first that I ever read, and this is exactly what solidified it for me. This is a modern classic for really good reason. If you haven't read it yet, autumn is definitely the perfect time, but it will rip your heart out. Then for romance, we have 4 more books. We have The Ex-Hex and The Kiss Curse, both by Erin Sterling. These are really witchy, autumnal, cozy romances, but also very spicy. I did actually own them. I just unhauled them because I knew I probably wouldn't reread them. I really enjoyed these when I read them. If you are looking for a spicy romance set during the autumn time with witchy vibes, these two are perfect. But another witchy book that isn't romance but definitely does have a romance subplot is The Secret Society of Irregular Witches. I read this one last year on my train to Edinburgh and it was the perfect vibe for it. This one is the epitome of cozy found family witches. I know a lot of people love this one. And one that isn't outright autumnal but it does have that sort of magical realism romance vibe is A Love Song for Ricky Wilde by Tia Williams. I read this about a month ago. It was an instant 5-star romance for me. I fell in love with it. I never cry at books. I cried at the ending of this. It is so cozy but simultaneously so deep. It deals with really serious topics. It is set in New York, which perhaps is why I feel that really cozy vibe. I just utterly fell in love with it, so any excuse I have to recommend it, I will. Then we have 4 fantasy books, 2 from the same author, Alex E. Harrow. We have Starling House and 6 Deaths of the Saint. Starling House is a haunted house sort of fantasy, sentient house. That was my favourite part of the book. I didn't really care for the romance subplot, but due to the sentient house and the atmosphere, I would recommend. And then 6 Deaths of the Saint. This is Kindle Unlimited, 50 pages short story, but I'm pretty sure that Alex E. Harrow very recently announced, I think it's being novelised, a full-on novel. This book floored me. Because of how short it is, please go into it knowing absolutely nothing, but I loved it. You'll read it in like 10 minutes. It was everything to me. And then last, and certainly not least, the last books I have to recommend for this video are some thrillers and horrors that I don't own physically. First one is also on Kindle Unlimited, and that is This Is Where We Talk Things Out by Caitlin Marco. This is a very short horror novella, literally again less than 100 pages. I read it in one sitting. The ending terrified me. Go into it knowing nothing, but because it's Kindle Unlimited, please just read it. Like, that's what I'm going to say on that one. We then have Murder Road by Simone St. James. This is a horror sort of thriller vibe. It is very spooky. I really loved it. I read it in a very recent reading vlog. I'll link that up above. It was my first Simone St. James. I definitely do want to read some more, but it was perfect for autumn. We then have A Haunting on the Hill by Elizabeth Hand. This was deemed by the Shirley Jackson Society as the sequel to A Haunting of Hill House. I don't think that should be true. I don't think that is personally the case. I think if I had read it with that knowledge and that title away, I would have enjoyed this a lot more. I am a huge Shirley Jackson fan. I was always going to be critical of anything deemed as the sequel to one of her most infamous texts. This one is its own haunted house story and horror I really enjoyed, so if you like a haunted house story, read that one. And then the last book is by an author who I have already mentioned, and that is Taylor Adams with The Last Word. This is a thriller that a lot of people were talking about last year. I love anything that Taylor Adams writes, like author by author. His thrillers never miss. This had me at the edge of my seat. I was terrified. So yeah, guys, that is the end of my 100+ recommendations for autumn. I am ending this at the perfect time because my battery is quite literally flashing. If you have read any of these books, there were a lot of them, please let me know what you thought about them, whether you like them or you dislike them. If you have any other autumn recommendations, please leave them down below. I'm all for more autumn recommendations. I kind of need some more, I'm not gonna lie. If you did enjoy this video and you're not yet subscribed, it would mean the world if you did consider doing so. I would absolutely love to have you here. And yeah, guys, thank you so much for being here and for spending some time with me. I really hope you enjoyed, and I will see you again very soon with another video.